Hello, good evening and hi, and thank you once again for joining us at Changing World Conversations with the University of Edinburgh, which have been inspired by the COP26 conference later on in Glasgow. Now, we've talked already about some fairly revolutionary concepts in those Changing World Conversations, and this evening we've got something which to me is so eye-opening. Now, and with a fabulous guest. Now, my name is Susan Morrison, I am your host, and you are part of the audience. You are part of the experience if you're watching us. If you're watching us on YouTube, there's a chat box function and you can send your questions in, which are then passed to me. And on the wonders of technology, iPad, I get to ask those questions of our panellists. And this is so exciting. This is just so interesting, Catherine. I'm so thrilled because this is about nature-inspired technologies. It's just three words that I just don't usually see together. It's just amazing. But before we get into that, Dr Katherine Dunn, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, at the moment I'm a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, but I've been interested in science and engineering since I was about 11. So I first got the bug when I was at school, and that I had a very enthusiastic physics teacher who would be showing how you can split white light into a rainbow with a prism. About the same time, Pathfinder landed on Mars, and we were able to watch that through the old dial-up internet, very grainy video, but it was absolutely amazing. Spent quite a few of my teenage years building model rockets. I was going to bring one today, but unfortunately couldn't work out how to transport it properly. So, yeah, it is a bit of an heirloom. So that's still at home. But then I went to university, went to the University of Oxford, studied physics, graduated with a first-class master's degree. Then I stayed on for postgraduate study, and I'd actually always been interested in biology and physics and engineering and how you can bring them all together. And with my doctorate I managed to tie those all together with nanotechnology as well, with the science of the very small. So I was looking at how you can use a biological molecule, in that case DNA, to actually build synthetic structures that are that you could fit many thousands of times across a human hair. And after that I moved on to the University of York, where I was looking at bioelectronics and biological computing as a postdoctoral researcher, before eventually coming to Edinburgh. I sometimes joke that I'm moving north throughout my career and eventually I'm going to end up in the Orkney Islands or something.
No, we're going to keep it here.
Well, so my job as a lecturer involves a bit of research and teaching, but my overall philosophy is that nature-inspired technologies can help us to solve some of the most challenging problems of the 21st century. So if we look about us and look at the natural world, we can get inspiration for how to build those new systems that could solve those problems like climate change. And hopefully today I'll be able to explain what I mean by nature-inspired technologies and convince you that they are part of the solution for climate change. So fingers crossed.
Right, okay, so first of all, I'm just so excited to hear that you did physics, biology, and all these things together, engineering, because in my educational career they were very, very separate. And yes, you were in physics or you were in biology, but there was absolutely no chance that you could cross over. But you seem to have brought them all together.
Very much so.
As Mother Nature actually does, I
Indeed,
guess.
yeah.
And you've got, but why take inspiration from nature?
Well, there are a couple of very good reasons for doing that. Firstly, we can't really help it. So nature is all around us, unless, of course, you're in the middle of a megacity. But the other reason is that nature has had millions of years to try out different things, to find optimal solutions to very tricky problems. The problem of staying alive in a changing world is itself a very difficult problem. So nature's been trying out all these different things, getting solutions that really work, and it makes sense to learn from the best. So your average engineer is going to have a few decades to invent things, but nature's had millions of years. So what's really exciting is that you can look at nature and find inspiration for almost any kind of technology, because nature is so diverse. We've actually got a picture, I think, showing a few examples of biological sources of inspiration. So there are some classic examples that we refer to when teaching our undergraduates. For instance, at the bottom of the screen you can see that big leaf. That is a lotus leaf, and it has a coating that is hydrophobic. So the water actually forms those big round droplets and rolls off. So maybe if we wanted to develop water repellent coatings, we would look to the lotus leaf for inspiration. If we wanted to develop materials that are strong and stretchy and maybe even have antimicrobial properties, we could look at spider silk. So that's the material that spiders use to make their webs. But the example that I've got at the top of that picture is a gecko. Now geckos are really rather cool animals because they can actually walk up walls or along ceilings, and if we wanted to look at new kinds of adhesive that can be stuck and unstuck in a reversible manner, we can look at how the gecko's feet are structured to enable them to actually do that. So these are some classic examples of biological inspiration that we can use to develop new technologies. But the first step to applying nature-inspired engineering is to actually define the problem that you want to solve. Right. So you need to say, this is the problem, this is what's required to solve it. And for tonight, of course, that problem is climate change.
It's climate change. I should also have mentioned, can you not mention spiders?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Mildly
I didn't bring any along with me, so it's just a picture of the web.
Sorry. But climate change is the problem, right? So give us a recap. Climate change 101.
Indeed. So if you want more details on this, then you can go back and watch the programme from a couple of nights ago called It's Not Too Late. But I'll just summarise the key issues here. Most people are probably aware that we've been pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere more and more since the Industrial Revolution. So from almost all areas of human activity, we're producing this carbon dioxide, and that's a problem because it traps heat and that's causing the global temperatures to increase. So there's much more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there used to be, and the planet is getting significantly hotter. So that's causing big changes in the planet's climate. We're seeing more extreme weather events, and this is a really huge problem that we have to sort out. It's not an easy problem to solve because there's carbon dioxide coming from all these different areas of activity, keeping the lights on, keeping ourselves warm, putting food on the table, getting from A to B. All of these things are causing us to pump carbon dioxide into the air. So we can't, there is no silver bullet. We've got to have solutions that deal with all of these different areas of activity. And really there are three things that we need to do. We need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, pull carbon dioxide out of the air, and also find ways to deal with the climate changes that have already happened and are unavoidable. And we can take inspiration from nature for technologies that will address all of these three things. In particular, something I'm going to talk about quite a lot today is electricity generation. So generating electricity and heat accounts for a very large percentage of the carbon dioxide emissions, which is why we're pushing towards more and more renewable sources, so wind and solar. In Scotland, it might seem to make more sense to use rain rather than sun as a power source. But in fact, we can still get quite a lot of energy out of the sun. It's surprising how much solar power could do in Scotland if we applied it.
Yes, it would be surprising.
It is surprising. But one of the big problems with solar power is that it's intermittent, like wind. So you don't have sunlight at night, and there's less in winter than summer. And what that means is that we need to couple these technologies with storage. So we don't just have solar panels on the roof, we need something like battery banks in order to store the electricity so that we can make dinner after dark using energy we got from the sun, or keep ourselves warm in winter using energy that fell on the solar panels during the summer, this kind of thing. And in fact, as I'll explain in a minute, the biological inspiration can help us look at new ways to both generate electricity and to store the energy for later use.
Oh, yeah, totally. So if it's a sunny day in Scotland, it's been known. How do we store the energy that's been generated? Where do we store it? But are there any nature-inspired ways of storing electricity?
There'll be some. So there are various kinds of biobatteries and so on. But actually, if we look at a classic biological system, just the plant, what that is doing is absorbing sunlight, and it's taking in the energy from the sunlight and using that to make sugar, basically, and make the biomass that it needs to keep itself alive. So what we can do is to look at the plant as a source of inspiration. The process of photosynthesis is the one that harvests that solar energy, and that is a process that makes life on Earth possible. So taking in the sunlight, taking in the carbon dioxide, taking in those things, and ultimately using them with water to make sugar and to keep the plant alive. So if we talk a little bit about what's inside a plant, I've got a picture showing the plant leaves and cells. I think our colleagues in the other room can show that on the screen.
We've also been joined by a
I think we might have
plant.
skipped. I think we've skipped one. So we've done things in a different order. Thanks, guys. So inside the plants, we have a whole host of plant cells, and those are packed with chloroplasts. And the chloroplasts are the site of photosynthesis. So we can make all kinds of devices by taking inspiration from the way that plants are absorbing the sunlight and processing it. So what happens in those chloroplasts is a series of reactions that involve movement of electrons and charged particles. And this sort of phenomenon can inspire us with development of new types of solar cell. And I actually have created a new word, which you saw briefly a moment ago. So if we can just go back to the new word, electrosynbionics. So this is a word that I've created to describe the creation of engineered devices using components derived from or inspired by biology to harvest, to generate, use or store electricity. So that could include biophotovoltaics, biobatteries, a whole range of different systems.
There's an awful lot of vowels and consonants getting thrown around for an old woman like me here. So what was that?
Biobatteries and biophotovoltaics.
So
I'll go back a step. So electrosynbionics first, as that's the new word. So that's got the three components: the electro bit, which is related to electricity; the syn part, which is related to synthetic devices, the idea that we're engineering things rather than just rather than using something, rather than doing something else. And then the bionic part, which is the inspiration from biology. So that's electrosynbionics. I then use the terms biobatteries and biophotovoltaics. So a biobattery is essentially a device that can produce electricity using a biological or bio-inspired mechanism. We can talk about a couple of examples of that sort of system in a bit. But the biophotovoltaic or biological solar cell is something that is using biological components to harvest sunlight. So that's the photo bit. And voltaic, create a voltage. So bio, biological, photo, light, voltaic, volts and electricity. So a biophotovoltaic is a device that will harvest energy from sunlight.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to wear my face of I really don't know if I believe you. Is there anything that actually does that?
Well, actually, you can create a form of biological photovoltaic using the chloroplasts from a plant cell. So you can extract the chloroplasts from leaves and from those plant tissues and dump them onto a surface, illuminate the chloroplast with light, and then that can, under the right conditions, generate a flow of electrons that you can harvest. And people have actually used those to power very small electronic devices. So it can be done. At the moment, these devices are not producing very much electricity, but it can be done.
So are these living things?
Not necessarily. So if you extract the chloroplast from the plant, It's not really
She's
living
not going
anymore.
to do that to you.
No, I promise. I didn't bring my lab kit, my lab coat, and all the equipment. Sorry. So that would not be living anymore. But you can actually make living photovoltaics using organisms called cyanobacteria or others, and these are actually living cells that are absorbing the sunlight and exporting electrons into the surroundings, and you can pick that up and use it as a current. So you can have either biological components in a non-living system or actually living photovoltaics.
So this is a solar cell.
It could be, yes. So photovoltaic and solar cell I tend to use interchangeably. So
So could it be could it be a form of new solar panel?
In principle, yes. At the moment, these devices are they're not producing the sort of output that we would need in order to put them on a roof and be useful. But the other problems that we have are the lifetime of the components. So if you take the components out of the plant cell and you try and use them on their own, then they may not last for very long. So they might wear out within about 30 minutes, which probably isn't very much use for a solar cell that you've put on your roof. No. You don't want to be replacing that every 30 minutes.
No.
So this is where some of the living systems could come in, because in principle they might be able to refresh themselves and have that longer lifetime that you need for viable systems.
But so that is, unless you want to jump up and down off your roof like some kind of deranged Santa Claus, then that's not going to. But are there any other biological systems that you could use to harness sunlight?
Absolutely. So there are. So it's not just plants and cyanobacteria that perform photosynthesis. There's also a type of microbe called Halobacteria, which lives in very high salt environments. Now, it's not actually a bacterium. It's just called Halobacteria. And this is quite an interesting species because it's this rather pretty purple colour, apart from anything else. And the purple colour is actually the thing that gives it its interesting properties. So this type of organism, like most cells, it's got its boundary of the organism is a membrane and an envelope. Okay, so membrane is a very thin layer, and embedded in that membrane are these molecules called bacteriorhodopsin. I think we have a nice picture and video somewhere. Yes, fantastic. So you can see this little video of the protein bacteriorhodopsin, and this structure is very small. So this is about 5 nanometers wide, which means that you could fit that thousands of times across a human hair. So obviously we can't see that structure. If we look at it at the human scale, it just looks like that purple material that you saw on the right. But this is a really interesting protein because what it does is it absorbs sunlight, and when it absorbs a little bit of solar energy, it can move a charged particle from one side of a membrane to another. And if you're moving a charged particle, you can build up a voltage. So this is a really clever way that nature has of turning that sunlight very directly into a tiny little voltage. So we can in principle harvest that, use that in photovoltaics. And actually a patent was filed in 2015 for a technology that does exactly this. So it uses bacteriorhodopsin to move charge from point A to point B, and that movement of an electric charge creates a voltage that you can in principle use.
So it's really a matter of scale.
It is, and also efficiency. So efficiency is the really important thing for solar cells generally. If you're harvesting sunlight but you lose 99% of the energy of the sunlight, then you're probably not going to have a viable device. So that's something we need to work on generally.
That's absolutely remarkable that there are so many biological phenomena that involve electrical effects. I'm sorry, it's never really crossed my mind before.
Absolutely, and I mean, even the ability to see depends on electrical effects. So actually the process by which the eye converts light into an electrical signal that your brain can process is very similar to the operating mechanism of bacteria rhodopsin. So when light falls in the eye, you get ultimately an electrical signal using a molecular phenomenon that's very like what bacteria rhodopsin does. And the flow of information from the brain to muscles is also an electrical phenomenon. So neurons are the cells that carry information from the brain to the muscles or from the skin back up to the brain, and they rely on the movement of charge as well. So it's not the case that charge moves from the fingers to the brain. That's not what happens. Instead, you have a really long cell, and you get a sort of wave sweeping down the cell. So at each point of the cell membrane, charge moves across the cell in response to a stimulus, and one little patch of the cell membrane depolarizes. So you get a change in voltage in one point, and then it kind of sweeps down like a domino effect. So the ions move only across the cell membrane at a particular part of the neuron, and then in the next bit, ions move that other tiny distance, then in the next bit some more ions move, and then at the very end of the neuron you have this voltage change that is going to actuate a muscle or convey information in some way. So it's not, but it's just important to note that you don't have an ion running all the way from the brain down to the feet, because it would take so long to get there that basically life would go at a much slower pace. It would take a year or something to raise your hand in the air.
Sometimes my life does go at that pace.
But of course, electric eels are probably the classic example of electrical effects in biology. And the electric eel can actually produce about 600 volts of discharge to shock its prey.
That's quite a smack.
Oh, absolutely. So this has been inspiration for batteries since, well, many, many years, centuries even. So there were papers being presented in the 1770s about the mechanism by which the electric about the electric eel. So these are a very good source of inspiration for biological batteries and electrosymbiotic techniques in general, because you have this biological phenomenon, and we understand a lot more about it now than we did in the 1770s, obviously. And we also have a lot of new materials and clever technologies that we can use to mimic what the electric eel does. And 600 volts is, as you say, quite a punch.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, could I wire an electric eel up to my phone to charge it up?
Possibly, but I think the eel might have something to say about that.
Probably tell me I'm not on that network, pal. You're not doing it. But I mean, are there any battery-like devices that use biological components yet, or are we too far back?
None actually sort of commercially available. So you can't go out and buy a biological battery tomorrow, I'm afraid. But there is an example that we can talk about. So this is an example of an electrosynbionic technology that I want to share with you. It's the concept known as an enzymatic fuel cell. So the term enzymatic refers to the biological component that actually is key to this whole process. So an enzyme, as you may have picked up in school, is a biological catalyst. It triggers a chemical reaction. And in this case, the chemical reaction that it triggers produces a flow of electrons. And that flow of electrons constitutes a current, which we can in principle use. So I have a short video that we can show in just a second of me building a very simple enzymatic fuel cell in the lab. Would have liked to have done the demonstration right here, but obviously it would have taken a bit too long to set up. And some of the chemicals I didn't particularly want to bring into a studio.
Are they dangerous?
Not particularly, but you don't want to drink them. Put it that
Try
way.
me.
Well, so we'll show a video, but before we do that, just to say, if you're watching this, don't try this at home unless you happen to have a fully equipped laboratory in your basement and you're either a fully qualified scientist or being supervised by one. So if we can cue the video, I can talk you through it. So the first step is to prepare the electrodes, and these are the electrodes. They're about 1 centimetre wide in the smallest dimension. They're paper coated with carbon. I've just added some copper tape there and some standard connectors so I can plug them into things. So the next step is for me to add a chemical called a mediator. This helps the electrons get out into the circuit. It's a substance that has a very long, complicated chemical name, which I won't repeat for you. It's abbreviated as PD, and I'm just spreading it out on the surface of the electrode to make the best use of that surface area. And then I leave it to soak in. The next step is to add the enzyme. That looks exactly the same as adding the mediator, so I didn't film it separately. And the next step is to prepare the fuel. So the fuel is glucose, and that's going to be broken down by the enzyme, which was called glucose oxidase because it oxidizes glucose. So if you look at the red arrow, you'll see that piece of paper. I'm just loading that with a glucose solution. So this is glucose, just like the sugar you might consume for energy purposes. So it can provide energy for an enzymatic fuel cell as well as for you doing exercise or whatever. Now I have to assemble a sandwich. That's the electrode I modified earlier. This is the fuel. And now I have the other electrode, which in this case has not had any mediator or enzyme or anything added to it. Could have, but hasn't. And now you're going to see a very important component coming in. This is a clip. It doesn't have to be pink, but it is in this case. So that is quite important because it holds the sandwich tightly together to make sure that there's electrical continuity between one side and the other. So that is the enzymatic fuel cell made. Now I need to test it. So I'm going to plug it into a box just like this and connect it to a diagnostic instrument. And you can see the little green circle at the left of the image. That is basically a measurement of voltage, and the fact that it's non-zero is telling me that this little enzymatic fuel cell is actually doing something. It's producing a voltage. So this is a very simple electrosynbionic device. We're not going to solve the energy crisis with those because they're very small and they're just made out of paper, and they produce small voltages and small currents. But this demonstration shows us some of the principles of electrosynbionics, namely that you can have a biological component that is producing electrons from a reaction involving a fuel. So this is a really interesting little demonstration that shows some of those key principles.
I think that was quite thrilling.
Well,
I mean, the first light bulbs blew up, and you know, the first cars were pretty bad, and virtually everything is tiny. But there's a it's that little green line, like a sudden little flickering light of hope. So, but what is the future for this?
So we've got a lot of work to do in this area. So, as you say, at the moment these technologies are at a very early stage, but we need to develop them. We need to increase the amount of electricity we're getting out of them. We need to increase the efficiency of light conversion into something useful. We need to make sure that these devices cost the sensible amount. Another really interesting thing is that we can, in principle, develop devices that actually suck carbon out of the air like plants. So maybe we can actually get that holy grail of a device that harvests solar energy, stores it until it's required, delivers electricity on demand, and sucks carbon out of the air, maybe.
You're not asking for much, are
no,
you?
Not asking for much. So, I mean, that's one of the aims of my research programme. That's the sort of device that we want to build. Obviously, when we're talking about carbon neutrality, we also have to look at all of the materials that go into the device. So we have to check that we're not accidentally releasing carbon somewhere along the way, because it's not just about the final device and when it's in operation, it's about the whole life cycle of the technology. So you really have to think about all steps. We have to make sure that we eliminate anything that might be slightly toxic, and that it's perfectly safe for use out in the wild, and also that it's safe to dispose of at the end of life. So some technologies are actually quite difficult to deal with when they come to the end of their life. So lithium-ion batteries, for example, that's actually quite a big topic at the moment. How do you recycle these things when you've finished using them, when they don't produce electricity anymore? So that's something that we have to look at. But the big priority, I think, at the moment is getting the performance up to the level where it is commercially viable to use electrosynbionic devices. So if anyone has a couple of £1 million they'd like to throw at this research, please do get in touch. I really want to hear from you. Don't suppose you've got some lying around, Susan?
Do you know, I've actually left my purse in mother bag.
Well,
sorry, Catherine.
yeah.
But if there is a billionaire out there and you're just thinking, what can I do with my cash? Should I build a space rocket or should I give it to Catherine? My money is give it to Catherine. So, and you definitely, when I win the lottery, obviously I'll be giving you a call.
Thank you, Susan.
That's quite all right. But are there any other the other technologies, the other biotechnologies? Are there other biotechnologies?
Many. So, as I said at the start, there are three things we need to do. We need to reduce the carbon emissions, we need to suck carbon out of the air, and we need to try and mitigate against some of the climate changes that we can't avoid. And in fact, nature-inspired technologies can help us with all of those. So anyone who caught the programme yesterday will have heard a bit about genetic engineering.
Yeah.
We can, in principle, use genetic engineering to create microorganisms that will suck carbon out of the air and potentially convert it into a valuable product. So you're then moving towards this idea of a circular economy, where essentially you're getting that carbon out of the air and it's going into something useful. And biological techniques are at the root of that. So you're using microbes, using biology to do something that's really helpful. But that's not all. You can also use biology to inspire architecture. There's one famous example of a building inspired by termite mounds. So termites make these nests, and the idea is that if you mimic the structure of that nest in a building, you don't have to use air conditioning because there is a passive ventilation mechanism that keeps it cool. So if you don't have to use air conditioning, then the building stays cooler than it would otherwise.
Yes.
And consequently, you don't have to run up your electricity bill. So you're preventing the carbon dioxide emissions and keeping the building cool. And also dealing with the fact that the average temperature is warmer, so you need cooling more than you otherwise would. You can take inspiration from animals that live in the desert to do that kind of thing, but you can also look at how animals living in the desert cope with water scarcity. So these animals have ways of making the most of a very small amount of water vapour and collecting that water to use to keep themselves alive. So maybe we can take inspiration from those creatures and design something that mimics what they do in order to provide water in those scarce regions, making the most of this very scarce resource when in drought-hit scenarios. And obviously, as the global temperature increases, droughts are becoming more common.
There seems to be a drive now to look at nature for inspiration and not exploitation. Do you feel very much part of that?
I think so, yeah. So I think that we should probably be looking to nature more than we are at the moment. So this whole idea of nature-inspired technology is getting more and more attention, but probably not enough. I think we could be putting a lot more attention towards this idea that nature has some wonderful ways of doing things. And if we just look around ourselves, go for a walk in the wood, look at a natural history program on television, we can get inspiration to do these things that otherwise we might spend hours and hours trying to figure out and still not come to a sensible solution. Nature's already done the work for us, so why not use that?
So why not learn from the best,
Exactly.
as you said earlier on. Now, don't forget, if you have questions, please get them onto the chat box function on the YouTube and send them in, and I will forward them on to Catherine. And we'll ask, but there's actually a few questions coming in right now. So Neil, hi Neil, thanks for joining us. Is there any extension of, you're going to make me say this, aren't you, biovoltaics? Did I say that? Yes, I'm a scientist. That can be translated into the human body to power, say, a pacemaker?
Fantastic question. And actually, in some ways, that is an easier objective than building these devices to power, for example, much bigger
phones or something.
Yeah, because a pacemaker only requires a really tiny amount of energy to keep going. So actually, there's quite a lot of work on building these biological batteries for use inside the body, partly because they're biologically compatible, so the materials might provoke less of a response from the body's immune system. So that's a really good question, and absolutely yes. And I think it's probably easier to build a battery to power a device like a pacemaker than it is to build a biological battery that's going to power a house, because the amount of energy involved is just so much smaller. Having said that, of course, when you're building something that's going to be implanted into the human body, there are certain things you have to be careful of, and you have to do the clinical trials, and you have to make sure that it's absolutely 100% compatible with the body. So there are different challenges, but in terms of the technical one of just getting enough volts to power that pacemaker, yes, it's doable.
However, someone has also come in with a question that slightly throws a spanner into the works there, Catherine. Biological molecules tend to decompose quite quickly. How long would biobatteries last?
Excellent question. I think one answer to that is we need to do the research to find out how long we can make them last. As I said, with the photosynthetic machinery, sometimes they only last for about 30 minutes, which is obviously not very practical. However, there are some molecules that might last longer than others. So what we need to do is to find the molecules that will last for a long time, maybe make them last longer by re-engineering them, and combine them with other things to extend their lifetime. But also that aspect of actually using living things like microbes within a device could help us to overcome the problem of how long they last, because if something is actually living, it can regenerate itself as you go along. So a plant, for example, will be continually growing and effectively keeping itself alive and fixing the damage that happens just as a result of being alive. So perhaps we can use that, and perhaps we can use some clever tricks to regenerate the molecules. But the real answer is we need more research. So we absolutely need to investigate this and to systematically look at how long these molecules will last. It's actually a topic that seems to be a little under-researched at the moment, partly because I think in some areas there's this feeling that if we're not getting a very high voltage, we don't need to worry too much about the lifetime, because it's not that practical anyway. But as we start getting the voltage up, we need these devices to last for a lot longer so that they're actually going to be practical. So excellent question.
Yeah, because if they can regenerate themselves, they could last forever. Rudvig has come in with a question. I love this one. That's because of the photograph that we had earlier. What's the latest in Gecko skin technology?
Excellent question.
Could you just remind me, the gecko's a funny little lizard, isn't it?
Yes, so a gecko is able to walk up walls and along ceilings because of the microscale and nanoscale structures on its toes. So essentially, as it pushes its foot against the surface, there's a huge surface area, much bigger than you'd expect because of the nature of these structures on the toes. And those structures actually interact with the molecules in the surface that it's pushing its foot against. In terms of what's the latest, I can't tell you what the absolute latest is, but I can give you a couple of examples. So it's going a bit off the theme of climate change, but it's nature inspired.
It's
so
geckos, and they're so cute.
They are cute. And NASA was actually investigating this as a technology for reversible adhesives. So using gecko-inspired grippers to get hold of things in space. I'm not sure if they actually if these things actually were used in space, but I know they were investigating them. And there are a couple of universities in the US that have built gecko robots that can actually walk up the side of a skyscraper. So there are genuinely some examples of this, but what the actual latest is, I couldn't say. I might be a few years out of date on.
Sounds pretty exciting to me, though.
Yes.
I mean, you could get a little robot that could go up the side of a building and deliver your takeaway.
Exactly.
Science is wonderful. Joshua, who is just absolutely charming, who's joined us for the previous 2 evenings and has joined us again. Hello, thank you once again, Joshua. What's the most scalable technology you're aware of with regards to power generation?
Scalable, do we mean, I don't know if we mean scalable in terms of electrosynbionic technologies or scalable generally. I'll take it as being nature-inspired technologies, as that's my thing. I think at the moment, I think we're a long way off from scale up. So this is one of those research questions that we have to investigate because, I mean, the technology that I showed, the enzymatic fuel cell, that isn't very scalable. So you wouldn't want to have a mountain of those in your basement because that's just not a great approach. But maybe a combination of different technologies will be really scalable. So I think the most scalable technology is the one we haven't entirely invented yet, or maybe the one that's sketched out on my notepad at home and hasn't yet been tested, which I can't say more about because
But you heard it here first.
Because if I did, I wouldn't be able to patent it later. So I can't blow the whistle on that yet.
Yeah, but we were the ones with the inside info, okay? So if you're still looking, billionaire out there still looking to invest, we're still here. So here's another really fascinating question. In the deep sea, there are bacteria that produce energy using chemosynthesis as there is no light. So is chemosynthesis being used for biobatteries?
No, very nice question. I mean, I think it could be. So this is a really interesting question because there's some fascinating biology in the deep sea. No light, really extreme conditions. There are all sorts of fantastic animals living down there. And looking at those and finding out exactly how they use their source, their very few sources of energy to stay alive would be really interesting, and I think that those things could be used for biological batteries because, I mean, the enzymatic fuel cell that I showed you it doesn't use light. That's taking the glucose and essentially the glucose is being broken down and you're getting the electrons out of that. So using some of these chemical reactions that might go on in those deep sea organisms is also a very viable method for generating new kinds of biobattery. Really, really cool suggestion, actually.
Really cool suggestion, because some of the images that are coming now from deep sea dives, which were much deeper than we've gone before, there are some remarkable things living down there. Absolutely extraordinary. And Joshua, he's come back in, and this is more of a thorny question for you, but let's go. Do these technologies have the potential to resolve the climate crisis without necessitating the reorganisation of our economic and social systems? Your starter for 10,
Oh,
Catherine.
good one. Thanks for the question. So I think I'd hesitate. I'd like to say yes, but I hesitate to say yes because I think that's a very large promise. But I think that any technology that allows us to start generating electricity and storing it in a very on-demand way and getting over the problem that renewables are intermittent is an excellent start, and it's something that allows us to tackle a significant chunk of our carbon dioxide emissions. However, as I said earlier, this is a very multifaceted problem, so it's not just about electricity. So we've also got to look at carbon capture and at other technologies, and I think the problem is so big that there is no silver bullet. I'd love to say that nature-inspired technologies are the whole solution, and I think they're potentially a very large chunk of the solution if they receive appropriate investment. But I don't think I can say with all conscience that they are the entire solution. And I think that some element of economic and social reorganisation is inevitable because this really is a colossal problem that affects everything we do. So definitely nature-inspired technologies can play a big part, but they can't be the whole solution.
You see, you did say something there that made me go, and it was, you said, without proper investment and research. And most of it, many people think it comes from private sector, but also the public sector is a huge investor as well. Do you think there's a possibility, and I know this is quite a shocking idea to put out there, that some of the politicians don't quite understand what you do?
Well, I'd be surprised if there are many politicians who've heard the word electrosynbionics, to be honest with you.
So would I.
So, I mean, given that I only invented the word quite recently, but I mean, I think generally science needs more funding. This is actually a topic that's in the news at the moment. We need to fund science and technology in order to make sure that we have the tools to deal with the climate crisis, other crises, and to actually not only survive but thrive in whatever whatever the future holds for us. So I think politicians, hopefully, I would like them to take on to say we're going to massively increase funding in the sciences. I'm not too optimistic that that's going to happen, but I wish they would.
Well, we can but dream. There's another question that has come in, and I think it goes back to the experiment we watched you with. What would be the benefits of using enzymes for fuel cells over other catalysts?
Another good question. So conventional fuel cells often run at very high temperatures and fairly extreme conditions. One of the really nice things about biological systems generally, which I should probably have said earlier but didn't, is that they run normally at sensible temperatures and the conditions are really quite friendly. So you don't need to go to really high temperatures, really high pressures. Those generally aren't very friendly to life. So you're normally operating in very benign conditions, and that makes it a lot easier to operate these devices. And hopefully that would allow us to make devices that are easier to use, maybe safer, maybe more practical. But the main thing is that we can operate them at just room temperature, and it doesn't require any extremes of temperature or pressure or anything like that.
Well, there's another question that's coming kind of on that subject. How many years away are we from seeing these technologies deployed? Usually scientists say 5 years instead of any question.
I'm not going to say quite 5 years because I think someone would probably tell me that's far too optimistic. I think the answer is, with appropriate investment, we could see these technologies coming on stream in time to make a contribution to the whole net zero objective. But I think 5 years is too quick. I wish it could be done in 5 years. So I think probably for realism, I'd say closer to 10 years.
How many people are working on this right now then, roughly?
Good question. So in my own research group, it's very small at the moment, but there are research groups all around the world looking at this. So there are groups in Europe, groups in the United States, and this idea is potentially a powerful one. There have been a couple of very interesting conferences recently, bringing people together who are interested in these hybrid biological and non-biological devices. So I think it's growing. I think the number of people who are looking at bioinspired technologies for this kind of problem is increasing, and I think that's the right way for things to go, because it's such a powerful approach.
It certainly is. And you just used the word problem there. Neil has brought in a question which addresses a problem. Is there anything in the bio world that can help support the nuclear power industry, either in the manufacture of fuel or its reprocessing, decommissioning? Thank Neil.
Good question. So that I usually claim that there's something in the natural world that can help with almost any technical problem that you can come up with. The first one that springs to mind is actually a sort of is the topic of bioremediation. So bioremediation, so using biology to fix environmental problems. So, for example, if you have an environment that's contaminated, you could potentially use re-engineered organisms to deal with that waste. Hopefully, we haven't got any natural environments that are contaminated with nuclear waste, but we could potentially use them in that way. So there is also some potentially interesting things to be looked at in terms of organisms that are very resistant to radiation. So I'm not sure how you would use those because I need to take a bit more time to think of it. But there are certain creatures and certain microbes that have much higher tolerances to radiation than others, and potentially we could look at those and see if we can use them for some sort of sensing purpose related to decommissioning or something like that. I'm sure there's a lot to be done in that sector.
Could they eat it?
I'm not sure that, well, maybe. I think they could potentially help to reprocess it, but I'd hesitate to be more definite about that because I haven't looked at this specifically. So
you can't do that anyway, Catherine, because you know full well that if a little microbe eats a lot of nuclear waste, it'll just get gianter and gianter and gianter, and it will turn into Godzilla and eat Tokyo, and we can't have that.
Well, no, I think the people of Tokyo would object. But
but it's happened to them too often, hasn't it? So. Can I ask you, what I find really fascinating about this is that, as I say, when I was at school, which was a very long time ago, there was biology, there was physics, there was chemistry, and they never, ever, ever met. Never. Not even the teachers spoke to each other. And but you seem to be on the cutting edge of a new frontier. You literally seem to be someone working across all of these disciplines. Is this a growing thing?
Absolutely. So I think I first started using the term interdisciplinary when I was writing my application for study at university, because I did all three sciences at A level, so physics, chemistry and biology, which was a little unusual.
Yes.
That was where I was starting to have these ideas about bringing together all of the disciplines. But over the years since then, it's become a growing thing. So there's the field of biophysics, using physics to study biology, and more people are bringing together ideas from different fields. And it's quite interesting because in the past, everything was getting more sort of specialised and more siloed. And over the last maybe 20 years or so, those silos have started to break down, and researchers are talking to each other, collaborating across disciplines. And I think we've almost gone full circle, because back in the day, there was science. Yeah. Then we had physics, chemistry, biology, and it's split into all these different things. And now I think the boundaries are starting to be blurred. So yes. Actually, if I was asked to come up with a single word that describes what I am, what I do, I'd probably say scientist, engineer. I wouldn't be more specific than that. So I think you're absolutely right. The divisions between the sciences are blurring, and we are getting a more powerful way of thinking as a result of moving between the disciplines and blurring those boundaries. There's some wonderful science being done at the interface between the traditional disciplines, and I think that the idea that we're all in silos has now been thrown out of the window. I don't think we can be, because some of the problems that we're now facing in the 21st century are so big that we can't just take ideas from one field anymore. I mean, even if you look at COVID, the pandemic, that requires ideas from so many different areas to resolve and to start moving.
Would you like to see that that interdisciplinary teaching of science start even earlier in schools? I mean, you mentioned the fact that they silo quite early, but is it time that we started to look at science in a far broader way?
I think that would be something we should move towards in the longer term. I think it would be quite difficult to do overnight because I think obviously everyone's used to teaching in the old way, but I think gradually starting to erode those boundaries younger and younger, and seeing that all of these different aspects of science are really all part of the same thing. So there are people studying the physics of photosynthesis and looking at how quantum physics can describe what's going on inside those chloroplasts and how the electrons are moving. And you can't imagine breaking that into physics and biology. It is the physics of photosynthesis. It's one thing. So I think the distinction between the sciences is not helpful much of the time.
I think it will have to break down in future. Yeah. There's a few more questions have come in. I think we've just got time to get a few more in. How close are we from using biotech to get CO2 out of the atmosphere instead of just planting trees? I've planted 4.
I have a dragon tree in my living room, and that's the closest I've got to sort of planting a tree. But I think probably quite close, actually. So I believe there are some companies that have been set up to look at exactly this. So I think we are quite close. I'm not sure if there's anyone actually with running field tests of this yet, but I think we are quite close.
I'll keep on planting the trees though.
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, apart from anything else, trees are just nice. So
the trees are nice.
I mean,
nicer than most politicians, actually, I think. If you go back to that.
Haven't met any politicians personally for quite a while.
I have, honestly. You go for the tree every time. There's another quick one. What's the nature-inspired technology you're most excited about? I'm thrilled about the geckos.
Well, I think it is electrosynbionics. It is this idea that we can build new solar cells and new batteries using components from biology. However, I have to admit I'm excited to some extent by all of the nature-inspired technologies that are out there. And this is one of the reasons why I set up a course in bio-inspired engineering at this university. So some of my students might even be on this in the audience today. So the point is that taking inspiration from nature can help us to solve so many problems that it is exciting just to even think about.
I'm excited about everything except the spiders. If you don't mind, I'll just leave them.
That's fine. That's why I picked the picture of the cobweb rather than an actual spider, because I thought a spider might be a bit much.
Yeah, you don't want to see me running down the corridor screaming because I'm still mic'd up. It would have been far too loud. Now this is I don't think it's a quick answer to this, but is it better to have teams of experts who all have their own area of expertise, or for individuals to become experts in lots of different areas?
Really good question. I've taken the approach of picking up expertise in several different areas, but a lot of people go for the sort of teams of specialists approach. So both can work, and I think it depends exactly what you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. In some cases, you really need a team of people who are all really specialists in one small niche. But sometimes being able to take that broader view and have within your own head all these different ideas floating around allows you to bring things together in a way that you couldn't if you'd specialised in one area. So either is fine, but it's going to depend on exactly what you're trying to achieve. So really we need both.
A good team leader, which I think I'm looking at, actually. Listen, have you got a take-home message for us?
Yeah, so I
Please leave us with hope.
Yes, so I think that the one take-home message is that technologies inspired by nature can help us to solve some of the most challenging problems of the 21st century. Climate change is one of them, and I think there's a lot of really exciting work to be done over the next few years to make this a reality and to get to a point where we are making a substantial contribution to the drive to net zero. So.
Thank you, absolutely. And I would just like to repeat what I said earlier, that if there is a friendly billionaire out there with a bit of cash rattling around in his back pocket, this is the woman you have to speak to. Katherine, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you
Susan.
so much. And it's all right, we plant. You were not harmed at all. Thank you very much for joining us here for Changing World Conversations with the University of Edinburgh. We're back again next Wednesday at 8 o'clock, and we will be discussing how to be a good ancestor. So if I were you guys, tune in to find out how you can leave a better planet and leave a better memory of yourself. But once again, thank you so much to Dr Katherine Dunn. Thank you to all of you who sent in questions. Thank you for joining us, and join us next week. Good night.